Armin, Luan, and Drita arrived in Liverpool with nothing but determination and a promise to survive. What started as a quiet struggle for work soon became the foundation of Europe's most secretive crime empire, one that operated in plain sight while no one noticed. In the early 1990s, northern Albania was a place frozen in time, isolated by rugged mountains and a history of political upheaval. Villages clung to steep hillsides, where generations had lived in the same homes, following the same traditions. The fall of communism had left a vacuum. The state could no longer provide, and people were left to fend for themselves. Families struggled to survive, relying on small plots of land, livestock, or occasional labor. For many young men, there was no future in the village. Dreams of education, stable jobs, or even simple comfort were distant, almost unattainable. The stories they heard from older relatives about life abroad sounded like fantasy cities, with lights that never dimmed, streets lined with opportunities, and money that could solve all problems. For those born into poverty, leaving Albania was not just a choice. It was a necessity. The journey out of Albania was never straightforward. Some took legal routes, applying for work permits or student visas, but the system was slow and riddled with obstacles. Others risked dangerous and illegal paths, slipping across borders with smugglers, often hiding in trucks or crossing rivers under cover of darkness. Every step required careful planning and nerves of steel. A wrong move could mean arrest, violence, or even death. Yet the risk was overshadowed by desperation and determination. Young men left their families behind, carrying letters of promise and small sums of cash, hoping to build something they could never have at home. Once they arrived in European countries like Italy, Germany, or the United Kingdom, the challenges did not end. They were outsiders, often unable to speak the language or understand the culture. They lived in cramped apartments, sometimes with dozens of others, sharing rooms and rationing food. Jobs were scarce, often low-paying and physically demanding. Construction, cleaning, factory work, or menial labor no one else wanted. But these young men adapted quickly, learning the rhythms of city life while staying in the shadows. They observed the local criminal landscape, noting who controlled what, how deals were made, and what mistakes to avoid. In these silent observations, seeds of future ambition were planted. What set them apart was their patience and invisibility. Unlike other migrant groups who sought recognition or status, these newcomers understood the power of being unnoticed. They did not flaunt wealth or seek attention. They worked long hours, sent money home, and gradually built networks of trust. By the time anyone realized their presence, they had already begun to form small alliances and connections that would later prove critical. Family loyalty was paramount. Promises made in the mountains of Albania were carried into every new city. Every decision, every risk, was measured against the potential to protect those back home. Even at this early stage, there were whispers of something unusual. Unlike typical criminal groups, they did not rely on noise, intimidation, or flashy power displays. They were quiet, disciplined, and remarkably organized, blending seamlessly into migrant neighborhoods, learning from the failures of others, and quietly preparing for a future that no one could yet see. The foundations of what would become a sprawling, silent empire were being laid, one calculated step at a time, in the shadows of European cities where nobody noticed them, and nobody ever expected what was to come. By the late 1990s, small groups of Albanians had begun to settle in British cities, drawn by the promise of work, opportunity, and a chance to escape the hardships of their homeland. Liverpool became a particularly strategic destination. Its long history as a port city meant it was connected to international trade routes, and its diverse neighborhoods were home to generations of working class families who were accustomed to outsiders coming and going. For the Albanians, this meant they could move into the city without attracting immediate attention, quietly embedding themselves into communities that were themselves familiar with economic struggle and resilience. At first, their presence was barely noticed. They took jobs that locals often rejected, cleaning offices, unloading docks, working in construction, and performing any labor that required endurance rather than credentials. As the Albanian groups settled, they began to understand the subtle rhythms of the city. They observed the way local gangs operated, noting the hierarchy, methods of intimidation, and weaknesses. Unlike the loud and aggressive British gangs, the Albanians relied on discretion. They avoided flashy cars, public disputes, and unnecessary attention. Their influence grew silently, like roots spreading underground, unnoticed by those who assumed power was visible only in violence or chaos. Even as they performed menial labor during the day, they began forming networks within their own community, maintaining close family ties and connections with contacts back in Albania. Money was sent home regularly, not as charity, but as a way of building influence, loyalty, and support. These small remittances transformed villages in northern Albania, creating pockets of prosperity that further cemented the sense of trust and obligation between those in the city and their families abroad. Integration into Liverpool's underworld did not happen overnight. The Albanians were initially subcontracted by local gangs to perform low-level criminal tasks, running errands, moving goods, or delivering messages. They learned from these experiences, observing patterns of trust and betrayal, noting the inefficiencies, and identifying opportunities. Unlike many migrant groups who quickly sought recognition or dominance, these newcomers moved deliberately, avoiding direct confrontation, and instead focusing on learning every aspect of the system they were entering. Every small operation they undertook was an investment in understanding, an opportunity to gain knowledge without risk. What distinguished them was their combination of patience, intelligence, and loyalty. While other groups often relied on fear or reputation to secure power, the Albanians relied on meticulous organization and silence. They kept internal disputes private and dealt with issues swiftly and discreetly, ensuring that mistakes did not become public or attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. Their modest lifestyles served as camouflage, making them appear as ordinary workers while laying the foundation for something far larger. By quietly observing, learning, and embedding themselves in Liverpool's working-class neighborhoods, they began to create informal hierarchies and alliances. Trust became the currency, and secrecy was the code. Even as local authorities remained largely unaware, these early settlements in Liverpool marked the beginning of a long-term strategy, a methodical, patient approach to power that would allow them to expand influence without drawing the attention or ire that so often destroyed other criminal enterprises. In these quiet streets and modest homes, the blueprint of an empire was forming, invisible to the public eye and unstoppable in its silent determination. As the new millennium arrived, the Albanian presence in Liverpool had evolved from a small group of migrant workers into a network capable of operating on a much larger scale. What had started as observation and minor participation in local criminal activities transformed into something far more organized and ambitious. They had learned the city's rhythms, the weaknesses of local gangs, and the inefficiencies of law enforcement, and they began to exploit these insights with precision. Unlike many criminal organizations that announce themselves with violence, intimidation, or media attention, the Albanians remained almost invisible. Their rise was quiet, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Control of drug supply routes marked the first significant milestone. Local gangs, accustomed to operating independently, found themselves suddenly undercut. Shipments that once arrived late or were stolen now reached their destinations on schedule, with purity higher and prices lower. Competition that had been chaotic and fragmented began to vanish without notice. Police reports listed missing shipments or unexplained disappearances, but rarely could investigators trace these events back to the Albanians. Their method relied on efficiency rather than chaos. They had learned that real power came from control, not spectacle. Family ties back in Albania were a crucial advantage. They could secure consistent production and reliable transport, ensuring the supply of illegal goods was steady and dependable. Unlike other groups that relied on local alliances that could be broken by betrayal or greed, the Albanians depended on blood ties and long-term loyalty. Contracts were rarely spoken aloud. Agreements were understood through trust and shared history. This invisible infrastructure allowed them to dominate quietly, and anyone who attempted to interfere often vanished or was dealt with in a way that left no trace. Fear was implicit, and obedience came without threats. As their control strengthened, the Albanian groups diversified their operations. They moved beyond drugs into human trafficking, smuggling, and money laundering, using legitimate businesses as fronts. Restaurants, construction companies, and import-export firms became channels for transferring money across borders, further insulating the organization from law enforcement. Their presence in Liverpool was no longer just a migrant story. It was the emergence of an empire built on secrecy, patience, and careful observation. Each step was calculated, every action measured, and every decision informed by the long-term goal of dominance without detection. Despite the growing power, violence remained rare but precise. Public shootouts, street fights, or gang wars were unnecessary and avoided at all costs. When force was required, it was surgical. Targeted individuals disappeared. Debts were enforced quietly, and warnings were delivered indirectly. This restraint not only protected members from legal scrutiny, but also maintained the illusion of normalcy. Neighbors, businesses, and authorities saw only ordinary people working hard, sending money home, and living modestly, never suspecting the breadth of influence hidden beneath. By the mid-2000s, Liverpool's underworld had shifted entirely. The Albanian groups were no longer newcomers or minor players. They were the silent rulers of supply chains, controlling what others could not even fully trace. Their empire was invisible in plain sight, thriving on patience, loyalty, and a network of trust that spanned countries. The city had been taken over, not through noise or chaos, but through quiet calculation and an understanding of power that few had ever encountered. The silent takeover was complete, and the Albanians had proven that dominance could be achieved without ever raising a voice. By the mid-2000s, what the Albanians had built in Liverpool was no ordinary criminal organization. It was a new kind of empire, one that operated almost entirely in the shadows and relied on systems invisible to outsiders. Unlike traditional gangs that depend on brute force, flashy displays, or public intimidation, this organization thrived on secrecy, discipline, and trust. The leadership structure was unlike anything authorities were used to seeing. There were no public faces, no recorded meetings, and no hierarchical charts. Decisions were made quietly, often within families or through trusted intermediaries who carried instructions without leaving evidence. Loyalty was absolute, and members understood that betrayal was more than dangerous. It was unthinkable. Every member had a role, and each role was carefully monitored. Some oversaw the flow of goods, ensuring shipments arrived safely from production points in Albania and other parts of Europe. Others managed the distribution network within Liverpool, making sure that operations ran smoothly without attracting attention. Some handled financial transactions, moving cash through businesses that appeared legitimate, construction firms, import-export companies, and small retail shops. These businesses functioned as both covers and profit centers. Money would flow in from legal activities, intermingled with illicit gains, and then moved seamlessly across borders, making it nearly impossible for authorities to trace the true source. One of the most striking aspects of this empire was the way it blurred the lines between legality and criminality. By investing in small businesses and real estate, the organization created an appearance of normalcy. Members lived modest lives, avoiding luxury cars, expensive watches, or other symbols of wealth that might attract attention. In many ways, they were invisible, not because they lacked power, but because they understood the power of anonymity. Wealth was accumulated quietly, influence expanded without spectacle, and control was maintained without drama. This strategy allowed them to operate for years without triggering the alarms that usually accompany organized crime. The network extended beyond Liverpool, linking cities across Europe through trusted channels. Family connections in Albania remained the backbone of production and logistics. Villages that had once been impoverished were transformed almost overnight. New houses were built, small businesses flourished, and local communities benefited from the wealth sent home. These acts were not charity. They were investments in loyalty. Each remittance strengthened the ties that held the organization together, ensuring that every person involved had a personal stake in its survival. Violence, when used, was precise and controlled. Unlike other gangs that resorted to public confrontations to assert dominance, the Albanians eliminated threats quietly. Competitors who posed risks were removed without fanfare, sending subtle warnings to others who might challenge their authority. Fear was implied rather than displayed, and respect was earned through consistency, reliability, and the ability to act decisively when necessary. This quiet discipline allowed the organization to expand its reach without drawing attention. By the time authorities began to notice anomalies in supply chains, banking transactions, or sudden changes in the criminal landscape, the Albanians had already moved ahead, adapting to new threats and shifting their operations. Their empire was not just a criminal enterprise. It was a model of strategic patience and operational excellence. Liverpool had become a central hub for one of Europe's most sophisticated silent networks, a city taken not with guns or violence, but with meticulous planning, discretion, and the unshakable bond of trust. By the late 2000s, the Albanian network in Liverpool had grown so sophisticated that it began to attract the due attention of law enforcement, but not in the ways most authorities expected. Unlike traditional gangs whose operations are visible through street-level violence or overt criminal acts, the Albanians operated in a way that left very few traces. They rarely appeared in public disputes, avoided flashy displays of wealth, and kept their communications encrypted or verbal, passed through trusted channels. Investigators began to notice patterns, small anomalies in supply routes, shipping manifests, and financial flows that seemed to point to a single source. But even when incidents were linked, arrests often led nowhere. Those apprehended rarely had concrete information to share, and the code of silence within the organization was impenetrable. The first signs of trouble for the empire came not from street-level law enforcement, but from intelligence units piecing together larger networks. Europol and the UK's Serious Organized Crime Agency began to notice connections between cases that, on the surface, appeared unrelated. Drug seizures in Liverpool mirrored incidents in London and Birmingham, all involving the same methods of transport and packaging. Human trafficking operations shared logistical similarities. Money laundering schemes across Europe showed strikingly similar patterns in the way cash was moved through legitimate businesses. These connections suggested an overarching system, but tracing it back to specific individuals was nearly impossible. Despite mounting pressure, the Albanian groups adapted quickly. They were masters of flexibility and foresight, anticipating interference and shifting operations before authorities could respond. Shipments were rerouted through new ports, financial flows were disguised in new businesses, and contacts in Albania ensured the steady supply of resources. The organization's decentralized structure, based on trust and family ties, meant that removing a few members did not cripple operations. Even arrests failed to break loyalty. Imprisoned members continued to follow instructions and maintain silence, understanding that the survival of the network depended on cohesion above all else. Inside the organization, discipline and loyalty were reinforced through subtle but effective means. Members knew the consequences of betrayal were severe, but enforcement was rarely violent in public. Disappearances or mysterious accidents served as warnings, and rumors alone maintained order. Each member's personal connection to the broader network family, community, and long-standing relationships created a sense of personal accountability that no law enforcement agency could replicate. Trust was both a weapon and a shield, allowing the organization to function with remarkable efficiency, even under scrutiny. Meanwhile, authorities began to see the broader implications. The Albanian Empire was no longer confined to Liverpool. It was part of a transnational web that touched multiple European countries. Investigators realized that conventional policing methods, which often relied on informants, visible evidence, or surveillance, were inadequate. The organization operated in shadows, blending legal and illegal activities seamlessly. Patterns emerged in financial records, shipping documentation, and property ownership, but each clue was carefully obscured. Detectives faced the unsettling realization that the empire was designed to withstand pressure, adapting faster than the systems built to dismantle it. As law enforcement struggled to understand the scale and sophistication of the operation, the Albanians continued their expansion quietly. Their methods had proven resilient, their loyalty unbreakable, and their control over Liverpool's underworld nearly absolute. What began as a network of migrant workers had evolved into a disciplined, nearly untouchable criminal enterprise. The cracks that authorities noticed were not flaws in the system, but carefully managed vulnerabilities that allowed the empire to remain hidden, untouchable, and silently dominant. By the end of this period, the true challenge for investigators was clear. They were up against an organization built not on chaos, but on quiet precision, absolute loyalty, and an unshakable code of silence. The first major breakthrough in the investigation of the Albanian Empire came not through arrests or raids, but through financial intelligence. Law enforcement agencies across Europe had struggled for years to penetrate the organization's veil of secrecy, and traditional surveillance had yielded little. The empire's brilliance lay in its ability to operate without leaving visible traces. Shipments arrived on time, disputes were resolved quietly, and members maintained modest lives that drew no suspicion. But money, as it often does, eventually left patterns that could not be erased. Routine audits and financial investigations into Liverpool businesses began to uncover links between local enterprises and previously unconnected banks in Albania. The scale of these connections was staggering. Small family-run companies were funneling vast sums across borders, disguised as legitimate transactions, yet tied to operations that spanned multiple criminal enterprises. Authorities realized that they were not dealing with street-level crime, but a sophisticated transnational network that had carefully intertwined legality with illicit activity. The realization came slowly. Initial investigations into a handful of construction firms and import-export businesses seemed routine, nothing more than standard anti-money laundering checks. But as auditors traced accounts and cross-referenced transactions, a web of connections emerged. Liverpool businesses were tied to financial institutions in Albania, Italy, and other European hubs, all linked to the same network of trusted family contacts. Every discovery revealed a scale of operations that far exceeded anything previously imagined. The response was coordinated, but cautious. Europol, working alongside British authorities, developed a strategy to map the financial and logistical networks that underpinned the empire. Simultaneous raids were planned across multiple countries, aiming to seize assets, freeze bank accounts, and disrupt the flow of goods. Even then, the organization's leaders anticipated such moves. Operations were decentralized, so targeting a few individuals or businesses would not cripple the system. They had contingency plans and trusted lieutenants ready to reroute shipments, transfer money through alternative channels, and maintain influence over local operations. Despite the challenges, the financial exposure marked a turning point. Investigators could finally see the outlines of the empire, mapping relationships, shipments, and cash flows that had remained invisible for decades. It was a silent, almost invisible war. Authorities combing through spreadsheets and ledgers, while the organization continued to function in the shadows. Every transaction revealed new layers, showing how the empire had blended legitimate business with criminal enterprise so seamlessly that outsiders could easily be fooled. Even as raids and asset seizures began, the Albanians remained unusually calm. There were no dramatic shootouts, no public confrontations, no chaos in the streets. Those who were arrested remained loyal, offering nothing to authorities and maintaining the code that had sustained the empire for years. The network adapted quickly, shifting operations, opening new financial channels, and ensuring that supply chains remained intact. The financial breakthrough exposed not only the scale of the organization, but also its ingenuity. The Albanian Empire had been built to withstand scrutiny, but numbers, as impartial and persistent as they are, could not be hidden forever. Investigators now had a tool that could trace influence across borders, link shipments to accounts, and reveal the infrastructure that had allowed a quiet, invisible criminal empire to dominate Liverpool for more than a decade. For the first time, silence was met with scrutiny, and even the most disciplined empire had to confront the reality that its operations could be traced not through violence, but through the quiet, unrelenting trail of money. When arrests finally came, there was no dramatic spectacle, no sirens wailing through the streets, no public shootouts. The operation unfolded with a quiet precision that mirrored the methods of the empire it sought to dismantle. Law enforcement agencies coordinated across countries, moving in simultaneously to take key figures from homes, workplaces, and businesses. Teams approached the targets carefully, knowing that any misstep could alert others or compromise ongoing investigations. Yet even as the arrests were carried out, the scale of the empire meant that the full extent of the network remained elusive. Many leaders had already disappeared, leaving investigators with fragments of a system that had been years in the making. The first wave of detentions revealed a startling reality. The organization's discipline and loyalty were absolute. Those arrested offered no cooperation, revealing nothing about operations, contacts, or strategies. Inside the courtrooms, prosecutors struggled to explain the intricate web of influence, money, and supply chains that stretched from Liverpool to Albania and beyond. Each trial highlighted a fundamental problem for law enforcement. Even with arrests, the organization's structure was resilient. Removing a few individuals did not collapse operations. Because power was distributed, trust was embedded in families, and communication relied on long-standing, personal networks rather than formal hierarchies. In many ways, the empire began to fracture not through confrontation, but through absence. Some members vanished before warrants could be executed, slipping into safe houses or returning to Albania. Others quietly shifted responsibilities to trusted lieutenants, ensuring that operations continued even as law enforcement tried to disrupt them. This adaptability was a testament to the organization's original design, built to operate under scrutiny, resilient to pressure, and capable of absorbing shocks without losing functionality. The arrests marked a milestone, but they were not the dramatic end that outsiders might have expected. Meanwhile, Liverpool itself did not erupt into chaos. Drug markets adjusted, new gangs and opportunistic operators moved into vacuums, and life continued in the city's neighborhoods as if nothing had changed. For most residents, the Albanians had always been invisible, and even their absence went largely unnoticed. But beneath the surface, a silent power had been altered. The arrests created uncertainty within the network, forcing remaining members to rethink logistics, communications, and supply routes. Fear, though less visible, became a subtle tool of control. Those who remained understood that loyalty was no longer a guarantee, and caution became paramount. The aftermath also exposed the limitations of conventional law enforcement methods against such a disciplined, silent organization. Traditional approaches, raids, surveillance, informants, yielded only partial success. While arrests disrupted operations temporarily and signaled that authorities were paying attention, they could not fully dismantle a network designed to endure scrutiny. Analysts began to recognize that the true strength of the Albanian Empire lay not in its visibility or brute force, but in its invisibility, its adherence to trust, and its ability to adapt quietly. By the end of this phase, it was clear that Liverpool's criminal landscape had been forever altered, yet the empire itself had not entirely fallen. What emerged was a testament to strategic patience, discipline, and secrecy. The arrests served as a reminder that even the most silent of empires could face exposure, but they also highlighted the resilience of a system built to endure, to operate without fanfare, and to survive quietly even in the face of the law. In the end, the fall was muted, almost imperceptible, leaving behind questions, intrigue, and a stark lesson in the power of silence. Years after the first investigations and arrests, the shadow of the silent empire still lingers across Liverpool and beyond. The organization did not vanish in a single moment, nor did it collapse in a dramatic finale. Instead, it dissolved unevenly, fragment by fragment, leaving behind traces that are difficult to identify and even harder to erase. Some networks shrank, others adapted, and a few quietly merged into new structures. What remained was not a single group, but a legacy of methods, discipline, and silence that permanently changed how organized crime operated in Europe. For authorities, the case reshaped their understanding of power. It proved that dominance did not require visible violence or public fear. Control could be achieved through patience, logistics, and trust-based systems that operated beneath the surface. Investigators learned to look beyond street crime and focus on financial flows, shipping data, and cross-border family connections. Liverpool became a lesson in how a city could be influenced without realizing it, and how an underworld could change hands without a single public battle. Within the Albanian communities connected to the empire, the legacy was complex. Some villages in Albania still bear signs of sudden prosperity from years past large homes, improved infrastructure, and businesses that once thrived on foreign money. Yet alongside that wealth came caution and silence. People learned that asking questions was dangerous, even when the money stopped flowing. The empire had provided opportunity for some, but it also left behind fear, broken families, and lives shaped by secrecy. Success had come at a cost that could not be easily measured or undone. In Liverpool, the underworld adjusted quickly. Other groups stepped in to fill gaps, but none operated with the same level of discipline or invisibility. The Albanian model became a reference point, studied quietly by criminals and authorities alike. Its influence extended beyond crime itself, affecting how ports were monitored, how financial institutions tracked unusual transactions, and how international cooperation between agencies evolved. The empire's greatest impact was not the drugs moved or money laundered, but the systems it forced into existence to counter it. Despite years of scrutiny, many questions remain unanswered. Who truly led the empire? How far did its influence reach? How many operations were never discovered? The silence that protected the organization in its rise also obscured its full story in its decline. Files remain incomplete, investigations open-ended, and connections unproven. In many ways, the empire succeeded in its final act by leaving uncertainty behind. The story of the journey from Albania to Liverpool is ultimately a story of silence as power. The empire may no longer rule openly, but its methods continue to shape the criminal landscape of Europe. In the end, the most unsettling truth is not that such an empire existed, but that it thrived for so long without being seen, proving that the quietest forces are often the hardest to stop and the most dangerous to ignore.